It was just past 10 o'clock on the night of March 24th, 1944. The air was bitter cold, below freezing, and a thin layer of snow still covered the sandy ground of the German countryside. Inside the wooden barracks of Stalag Luft III, hundreds of Allied prisoners of war lay in their bunks, pretending to sleep. But sleep was the furthest thing from their minds. Beneath their feet, 30 feet underground, a tunnel stretched over 300 feet into the darkness. It had taken more than a year to dig. Thousands of men had contributed in some way, hauling sand, forging documents, stitching civilian clothes from scraps of blankets and uniforms. And now, after countless setbacks, betrayals by informers, and near discoveries by German guards, the moment had finally arrived. Tonight, over 200 men would attempt the largest and most audacious escape in the history of the Second World War. What they did not know, what none of them could have predicted, was that within 72 hours, 50 of them would be dead. Not killed in combat, not shot while fleeing. Executed. Murdered in cold blood, on the direct orders of Adolf Hitler himself. This is the true story of the Great Escape. To understand how 76 Allied airmen crawled through a narrow tunnel into the frozen German night, we must first understand the place they were trying to leave behind. Stalag Luft III was no ordinary prisoner of war camp. Located near the town of Sagan in Lower Silesia, roughly 100 miles southeast of Berlin, the camp was designed specifically to hold captured Allied aviators. These were not foot soldiers or ordinary conscripts. These were officers, pilots, navigators, bombardiers, and flight engineers from the Royal Air Force, the Royal Canadian Air Force, the Royal Australian Air Force, and the United States Air Force. They were educated, resourceful, and they had one thing in common: every single one of them had been shot down over occupied Europe while carrying out bombing raids against the Nazi war machine. The Luftwaffe, which administered the camp, knew exactly who they were dealing with. These men had already proven their courage in the skis over Germany. They were not the type to sit quietly behind barbed wire. And so, the Germans built Stalag Luft III with escape prevention as its primary purpose. The camp sat on ground that had been deliberately chosen for its sandy soil. The theory was simple: tunnels would collapse before they could reach any useful length. The sand was bright yellow, impossible to hide and easy for guards to spot if it appeared anywhere on the surface. The barracks themselves were elevated off the ground on wooden stilts, allowing guards to peer beneath them with flashlights and listen for digging. Microphones had been buried around the perimeter to detect the sounds of tunneling. Seismograph sensors monitored vibrations in the earth. The fences were double-layered, with coils of razor wire between them. Guard towers equipped with searchlights and machine guns stood at regular intervals. And just inside the main fence, a warning wire ran at knee height. Any prisoner who crossed that wire, intentionally or not, could be shot without warning. By 1943, Stalag Luft III held thousands of Allied officers across multiple compounds. The North Compound, which opened in April of that year, would become the site of the most famous escape attempt in history. And at the center of it all was a man the Germans never should have captured alive. His name was Squadron Leader Roger Bushell. To his fellow prisoners, he was known simply as Big X. The mastermind, the organizer, the man who turned escape from a hopeful dream into an industrial operation. Bushell was 33 years old in 1944. Born in South Africa, educated in England, he had been a successful barrister before the war, a lawyer known for his sharp mind and even sharper tongue. He spoke fluent German and French. He was a competitive skier, and he had already escaped from German captivity twice before. The first time, in 1941, he had made it all the way to the Swiss border before being recaptured. The second time, he had hidden in Prague for months, sheltered by the Czech resistance, before the Gestapo tracked him down following the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich. When he was returned to Stalag Luft III in late 1942, the Germans issued him a personal warning. If he attempted to escape again, he would be shot. Bushell smiled politely, and then he began planning the most ambitious escape in history. His vision was staggering in its scope. Previous escape attempts had focused on getting a handful of men out, 2, 5, maybe a dozen at most. Bushell wanted to get 200 men out in a single night. The logic was both practical and psychological. A mass escape would overwhelm German search capabilities. It would force the Nazis to divert thousands of soldiers, policemen, and Gestapo agents away from the front lines to hunt for escaped prisoners. It would embarrass the Luftwaffe, and it would prove to the world, and to the prisoners themselves, that the Allied spirit could not be broken. "Everyone here," Bushell told his inner circle, "has a duty to escape, not just for ourselves, but for the war effort. Every German soldier hunting for us is a soldier not fighting on the Eastern Front." He called his organization simply X-Organization, and over the next 12 months, it would grow into one of the most sophisticated covert operations of the entire war. The plan called for 3 tunnels to be dug simultaneously. They were given code names: Tom, Dick, and Harry. Tom would run westward from Hut 123, passing beneath the warning wire, the main fence, and emerging in the forest beyond. Dick would run from Hut 122. And Harry, the longest and most ambitious, would stretch over 300 feet from Hut 104, passing beneath the entire northern perimeter. The logic behind digging 3 tunnels was simple: redundancy. If the Germans discovered one tunnel, work could continue on the others. If 2 were found, there would still be one left. Little did the prisoners know that only one of these tunnels would ever reach the forest beyond the wire. And what happened next would become legendary, not for its triumph, but for its tragedy. As Squadron Leader Roger Bushell gathered his most trusted officers in the dim light of Hut 104, the scope of what they were about to attempt began to sink in. They would need engineers to dig, carpenters to shore up the tunnel walls, electricians to run the lighting, tailors create civilian clothing, forgers to produce identity documents, map makers, compass makers, lookouts, diversionary teams. They would need to move over 100 tons of sand without the Germans noticing. And they would need to do it all under the watchful eyes of the most escape-proof camp in Nazi Germany. The odds were impossible. But these men had already defied the odds once, in the skis over Europe. They were about to do it again. The construction of the 3 tunnels began in April 1943, just weeks after the North Compound opened. From the very first day, Roger Bushell understood that success would depend not on luck, but on organization. He divided the entire escape operation into specialized departments, each with its own leader, its own team, and its own carefully defined responsibilities. It was, in effect, a secret military operation running beneath the noses of the German guards. The tunneling itself was overseen by a Polish RAF officer named Flight Lieutenant Wally Floody. Before the war, Floody had worked in the gold mines of northern Ontario, Canada. He knew how to dig. He knew how to shore up an unstable earth, and he knew how to keep men alive underground. Floody's challenge was immense. The yellow sand beneath Stalag Luft III was loose and prone to collapse. Traditional tunneling methods would not work. Every inch of the tunnel walls would need to be reinforced with wooden boards, and there was no lumber to spare. The solution came from the barracks themselves. Under Floody's direction, prisoners carefully dismantled the wooden bed boards that supported their mattresses. Each barrack contained dozens of bunks, and each bunk contained multiple slats. By removing a few boards from each bed, never enough to be noticed during inspections, the prisoners accumulated thousands of feet of lumber. The men slept on increasingly uncomfortable bunks, their bodies sagging through the gaps. But no one complained. Every board removed was another foot of tunnel shored up. The tunnels themselves were engineering marvels. Each one began with a vertical shaft, approximately 30 feet deep, dug straight down from a concealed entrance. The entrances were hidden in ingenious locations: beneath a heating stove in Hut 104, under a drain sump in the washroom of Hut 122, and inside a chimney base in Hut 123. The stove entrance for Tunnel Harry became the most famous. The entire iron stove, which weighed over 500 pounds, sat on a concrete base. That base was actually a removable trapdoor, carefully fitted to leave no visible seams. When the stove was lifted by a concealed lever, the trapdoor swung open to reveal the shaft below. German guards walked past that stove dozens of times a day. They never suspected a thing. From the bottom of each shaft, the horizontal tunnels stretched outward toward the perimeter fence. The tunnels were remarkably small, only 2 feet square, just wide enough for a man to crawl through on his belly. But these were not primitive dirt holes. The walls were lined with wooden bedboards, fitted together like the inside of a box. A wooden railway track ran along the floor, and small trolleys, built from hockey skates and scrap metal, carried diggers and sand back and forth. An ingenious ventilation system pumped fresh air from the surface through a pipeline made of powdered milk tins, connected end to end. And perhaps most remarkably, the tunnels had electric lighting. German electricians had wired the camp for power. What they did not realize was that prisoners had secretly tapped into the electrical lines, running stolen wire down the shafts and along the tunnel ceilings. Bare light bulbs, liberated from the barracks during blackout drills, illuminated the narrow passageways in pale yellow light. The men worked in that light for hours at a time, lying flat on their stomachs, scraping at the sand with makeshift tools fashioned from metal cans. But digging was only half the problem. The sand had to go somewhere. Every foot of tunnel produced enormous quantities of bright yellow sand, sand that would immediately alert the Germans if it appeared anywhere on the surface. The disposal of this sand became one of the most critical operations of the entire escape effort. The man in charge was a young Australian pilot named Flight Lieutenant Peter Fanshawe. His solution was both brilliant and audacious. Prisoners fashioned long cloth bags, nicknamed sausages, from old trouser legs. These bags could be worn inside a man's pants, suspended from a loop around his neck. Each sausage held several pounds of sand and hung down along the inside of the leg. Every day, dozens of prisoners walked casually around the compound with sand-filled sausages hidden beneath their trousers. They had pins in their pockets connected to strings that opened the bottom of each bag. When they reached a designated spot, a garden plot, a patch of dirt near the exercise field, an area being dug for a new latrine, they would release the pin and let the yellow sand trickle out around their feet. Other prisoners, called stooges, would immediately cover the yellow sand with gray topsoil, mixing it in before the guards could notice. At the peak of operations, over 200 men were involved in sand dispersal alone. They called themselves the Penguins, waddling around the compound with their legs held stiff to prevent the sausages from swinging. The Germans never understood why so many prisoners seemed to walk so strangely. Meanwhile, other departments worked around the clock. Flight Lieutenant Tommy Guest led the tailoring section. His team transformed old uniforms, blankets, and scraps of fabric into civilian suits, worker overalls, and even German military uniforms. Dyes were created from boot polish, inks, and the covers of books. Buttons were carved from melted phonograph records. Flight Lieutenant Tim Whalen commanded the forgery section. Using hand-carved stamps and carefully copied German typefaces, his team produced hundreds of identity documents, work permits, travel passes, letters of employment, and military leave papers. The forgeries were so accurate that they fooled German officials for weeks after the escape. Flight Lieutenant Al Hake ran the compass section, producing miniature compasses from melted phonograph records and magnetized needles. Flight Lieutenant Des Plunkett created detailed maps of Germany, Poland, and the surrounding regions, copied painstakingly from originals that had been smuggled into the camp or memorized by newly arrived prisoners. Every department was connected. Every man had a role, and every piece of the operation was designed to support one goal: getting 200 men out of Stalag Luft III and back to Allied territory. But in September 1943, disaster struck. The Germans found Tunnel Tom. A routine search of Hut 123 revealed the concealed entrance near the chimney. Guards ripped up the floorboards and exposed the shaft below. They followed the tunnel for over 100 feet before it ended at the digging face. Months of work destroyed in minutes. The prisoners watched in silence as German soldiers poured sand back into the tunnel and demolished the entrance. The guards were triumphant. They believed they had crushed the escape spirit once and for all. They were wronged. Tunnel Dick had already been converted into a storage facility for escape supplies, clothing, documents, maps, and compasses. It would never reach the surface, but Tunnel Harry remained intact. The Germans had not found it. Roger Bushell made the decision immediately. All resources, all manpower, all materials would now be focused on completing Harry. The tunnel would need to extend over 300 feet to clear the fence and reach the tree line. By January 1944, the diggers were making remarkable progress, but time was running out. Intelligence suggested the Germans were planning to move prisoners to other camps. If the escape was going to happen, it had to happen soon. The date was set, March 24, 1944. In less than 3 months, over 200 men would attempt to crawl through that narrow tunnel into the frozen German night. Many of them would never return. By early March 1944, Tunnel Harry stretched 270 feet beneath the frozen German earth. The diggers worked in shifts around the clock, clawing at the sand with bleeding fingers, their bodies cramped in the narrow 2-foot square passage. The air at the digging face was thick and stale despite the ventilation system. Men fainted regularly. Some suffered panic attacks in the claustrophobic darkness. But they kept digging. Every inch brought them closer to freedom. Flight Lieutenant Wally Floody calculated that the tunnel would need to reach at least 330 feet to emerge safely beyond the tree line. Any shorter, and the exit would be visible to the guards in the watchtowers. Any deviation from the planned direction, and the tunnel might surface inside the perimeter, a death sentence for everyone involved. Navigation underground was a constant challenge. The diggers used a homemade compass and measured progress by counting the number of bedboards installed along the walls. But in the darkness, disorientation was always a threat. To verify their direction, the prisoners devised an ingenious method. They would drive a long metal rod upward through the ceiling of the tunnel until it broke through the surface. A lookout above would spot the rod, measure its position relative to known landmarks, and signal corrections back through a series of coded messages. The Germans never noticed the thin metal rods appearing briefly in the snow before being pulled back underground. As the tunnel neared completion, Roger Bushell turned his attention to the most difficult question of all: who would escape? Over 600 men had contributed to the tunnel's construction. Diggers, engineers, forgers, tailors, lookouts, penguin sand carriers, every man in the North Compound had played some role. By rights, they all deserved a chance at freedom. But the tunnel could only accommodate so many men in a single night. Bushell estimated that under ideal conditions, approximately 200 prisoners could crawl through Harry before dawn forced them to seal the exit. 200 men, out of 600 who had risked everything. The selection process was agonizing. Bushell divided the escapers into 3 categories. The first group, approximately 30 men, were designated as serial offenders. These were prisoners who spoke fluent German or French, who had civilian clothing and high-quality forged documents, and who had realistic plans for reaching neutral territory. They would go first when the tunnel was freshest and the Germans least alert. The second group, approximately 40 men, were those who had contributed most significantly to the tunnel's construction. Department heads, key diggers, essential forgers. These men had earned their place through months of backbreaking labor and constant risk. The third group, approximately 130 men, would be selected by lottery. Every eligible prisoner would draw a number. Those with the lowest numbers would escape. The rest would remain behind. It was the only fair system Bushell could devise, but it meant that many men who had sacrificed everything for the tunnel would watch from their bunks as others crawled toward freedom. The lottery was held in secret over several nights in mid-March. Men gathered in small groups, drawing slips of paper from a hat. Some wept with relief when they drew low numbers. Others accepted their fate with quiet resignation. Squadron Leader Roger Bushell drew number 4. He would be among the first to escape, a decision that would seal his fate. The final days before the escape were a blur of frantic activity. The forgery department worked through the nights, completing the last identity documents. Over 200 sets of papers were produced: German work permits, French travel passes, identity cards stamped with official-looking seals. Each document was tailored to the individual escaper's cover story. Some men would pose as foreign workers traveling to new labor assignments. Others would pretend to be German businessmen on official trips. A few, the boldest, would wear homemade German military uniforms and attempt to bluff their way through checkpoints. The tailoring department made final adjustments to civilian clothing. Suits were pressed with heated metal plates. Hats were shaped over wooden blocks. Ties were knotted and reknotted until they looked appropriately worn. The map section distributed hand-drawn charts showing railway lines, safe houses, and routes to neutral Switzerland, Sweden, and Spain. Some escapers memorized their routes. Others concealed tiny maps inside coat linings and shoe heels. The compass section handed out hundreds of miniature compasses, some no larger than a button. These were hidden in hollowed-out boot heels, sewn into lapels, and concealed inside fountain pens. Food was stockpiled. The prisoners had been saving rations for months: chocolate bars, biscuits, dried meat, vitamin tablets. Each escaper would carry enough supplies to survive several days on the run. And then, on March 23, 1944, disaster nearly struck again. The Gestapo arrived at Stalag Luft III. Specifically, they came for Flight Lieutenant Wally Floody, the Canadian mining engineer who had designed and supervised the construction of all 3 tunnels. Someone, somewhere, had talked. The Germans knew Floody was involved in escape activities, though they did not know the full extent of his role. Floody was transferred immediately to another compound within the camp, Belaria, located several miles away. He would not be present for the escape he had made possible. The timing was devastating. Floody's expertise was irreplaceable. His knowledge of the tunnel's structural weaknesses, its ventilation system, its electrical wiring, all of it walked out the gate with him. But there was no time for mourning. The escape was scheduled for the following night. Roger Bushell gathered his remaining leadership team. Flight Lieutenant Johnny Bull would take over tunnel operations. Flight Lieutenant Harry Marshall would coordinate the movement of escapers from the barracks to the tunnel entrance. Squadron Leader John Williams would manage the exit shaft. "Nothing changes," Bushell said firmly. "We're going tomorrow night, all 200 of us." The men nodded grimly. They had come too far to stop now. March 24, 1944, dawned gray and cold. A light snow had fallen overnight, dusting the compound in white. The temperature hovered just below freezing. Heavy clouds blocked the moon, perfect conditions for an escape. Throughout the day, the 200 selected escapers went about their normal routines, careful not to attract attention. They attended roll call. They walked the perimeter. They played cards and read books and laughed at jokes they barely heard. Inside, their hearts were pounding. By late afternoon, the escapers began drifting toward Hut 104 in small groups. They carried their escape kits hidden beneath their clothing, civilian suits worn under military greatcoats, forged documents tucked into pockets, compasses and maps concealed in shoes and hats. The barrack filled slowly. By 8 o'clock, over 200 men were crammed into the small wooden building, sitting on bunks, leaning against walls, waiting in tense silence. At 8:30 p.m., the lights in the compound flickered, the signal that the Germans had switched off the perimeter lighting for the night. Blackout conditions had begun. Johnny Bull climbed down the shaft first, inspecting the tunnel one final time. He crawled the entire 330-foot length, checking the wooden supports, testing the ventilation, and ensuring the trolley system was operational. At 9:45 p.m., he reached the exit shaft. And his heart sank. The tunnel was too short. When Bull broke through the frozen surface and peered out into the darkness, he expected to see the dense tree line of the forest surrounding the camp. Instead, he found himself staring at open ground. The exit shaft had emerged approximately 10 feet short of the trees. The hole was clearly visible from the nearest guard tower, less than 50 yards away. Bull remained frozen, his head barely above ground level, watching the beam of a searchlight sweep across the snow. If the guard turned at the wrong moment, the entire escape would be discovered. For several agonizing minutes, Bull lay motionless, calculating the options. Retreat was unthinkable. 200 men were waiting in the tunnel behind him. Months of work had led to this moment. They could not dig another 10 feet in a single night. The only option was to proceed and pray. Bull slithered out of the hole and crawled on his belly through the snow, reaching the cover of the trees just as the searchlight swept back toward his position. He tied a rope to a tree trunk and dropped the other end back into the tunnel. Each escaper would have to wait for a tug on the rope, the signal that the searchlight had passed and it was safe to emerge. It would slow everything down. Instead of 1 man per minute, they would be lucky to manage 1 man every 5 minutes. But there was no other choice. At 10:30 p.m., the first escaper began crawling through Tunnel Harry. His name was Squadron Leader Johnny Dodge, a 50-year-old American-born British officer who had already been captured 3 times in this war. Dodge moved slowly through the narrow passage, pulling himself along the trolley rails, his civilian suit scraping against the sandy walls. Behind him, the tunnel stretched back toward Hut 104, where 199 other men waited their turn. The great escape had begun. One by one, the escapers descended the shaft and crawled toward freedom. The process was painstaking. Each man had to wait for the trolley to return, load himself onto the small wooden platform, and be pulled along the railway by a rope system operated by other prisoners stationed at intervals along the tunnel. At the exit shaft, each man waited in darkness for the tug on the rope. Then he would climb the ladder, emerge into the frozen night, and crawl through the snow toward the trees. Some men moved quickly, their hearts pounding with adrenaline. Others froze at the exit, paralyzed by the sight of the guard tower so close, the searchlight sweeping so near. But they kept coming. Roger Bushell emerged around 11:00 p.m., the 4th man out. He wore a well-tailored business suit beneath his coat, carried forged papers identifying him as a French businessman, and spoke flawless German with a convincing accent. He disappeared into the darkness without looking back. By midnight, only 20 men had escaped. The pace was far slower than anyone had anticipated. The short tunnel, the rope signal system, the frozen ground at the exit, everything conspired to delay the operation. And then at 12:55 a.m., the tunnel suffered a catastrophic failure. The electric lights went out. Somewhere along the 330-foot passage, a connection had failed. The tunnel plunged into absolute darkness. Men who had been crawling forward stopped in confusion. The trolley system ground to a halt. For 20 agonizing minutes, the escape was paralyzed. Flight Lieutenant Harry Marshall worked frantically to locate the break in the wiring. Finally, using a flashlight smuggled from the camp guards, he found the damaged connection and spliced the wires back together. The lights flickered on, the escape resumed. But precious time had been lost. The clock ticked past 1 in the morning. Inside the tunnel, men lay in a single-file line stretching back nearly 330 feet, from the exit shaft beneath the frozen forest floor, through the narrow passage reinforced with 2,000 bed boards, down to the vertical shaft beneath the stove in Hut 104. They waited in near silence, their breath visible in the cold underground air, their bodies pressed against the damp sand. Above them, the German guards continued their routine patrols, utterly unaware that dozens of Allied prisoners were slithering beneath their feet. Flight Lieutenant Les Broderick reached the exit shaft around 1:30 a.m. He was a young Australian navigator who had been shot down over Hamburg 18 months earlier. Like the others before him, he waited at the bottom of the ladder, listening to the muffled sounds of the night above. The tug came on the rope, the searchlight had passed. Broderick climbed the ladder and emerged into a world of white. Snow covered everything, the ground, the trees, the distant rooftops of the camp buildings. The cold hit him immediately, biting through his thin civilian coat, numbing his fingers within seconds. He crawled forward on his belly, following the tracks of the men who had gone before him. The snow was deeper than expected, nearly 8 inches in places, and it slowed his progress considerably. When he finally reached the tree line, he lay still for a moment, catching his breath. Then he rose to his feet and began walking north, toward the railway station at Sagan. He did not look back. By 2:00 a.m., approximately 35 men had escaped. The pace had improved slightly after the electrical failure was repaired, but it was still far slower than planned. At this rate, fewer than 100 men would make it out before dawn, half of the planned 200. Roger Bushell had calculated that they would need to seal the tunnel by 5:00 a.m. at the latest. After that, the rising sun would illuminate the exit hole, and the German guards would surely spot it during their morning rounds. 3 hours remained. Perhaps 60 more men could escape. It would have to be enough. Inside the tunnel, the atmosphere was growing increasingly tense. Men who had been waiting for hours were becoming restless. The air, despite the ventilation system, was thick and difficult to breathe. Some prisoners experienced waves of claustrophobia, their chests tightening, their minds screaming at them to turn back. But turning back was not an option. The tunnel was only 2 feet wide. There was no room to reverse direction. The only way out was forward. Flight Lieutenant Tony Bethel reached the halfway point around 2:15 a.m. He was lying on the wooden trolley, being pulled along the narrow railway by the rope system, when the trolley suddenly jammed. A section of the rail had shifted, knocked loose by the passage of so many men. The trolley wheels caught on the displaced wood and refused to move. Bethel was stuck. For several minutes he struggled in the darkness, trying to free the trolley with his hands. The space was too cramped to use any real force. Other men backed up behind him, their progress halted by the obstruction. Finally, Bethel managed to lift the trolley slightly and kick the displaced rail back into position. The wheels caught, and the rope began pulling him forward again. But another 15 minutes had been lost. At the exit shaft, Squadron Leader John Williams maintained his position as controller. It was his job to manage the timing, to tug the rope when the searchlight passed, to signal each man when it was safe to emerge. Williams had been lying in the cold for nearly 4 hours. His body was numb. His fingers had lost all feeling. Frost had formed on his eyebrows and the stubble on his chin. But he did not move. He could not move. The lives of nearly 200 men depended on his timing. Above him, the searchlight from the nearest guard tower swept across the snow in a predictable pattern. Every 90 seconds, the beam would pass directly over the exit hole. Every 90 seconds, Williams would freeze, praying that the guard did not look down at precisely the wrong moment. The hole was partially concealed by branches and loose snow, but it was not invisible. A careful observer would notice the dark gap in the white landscape. A curious guard might investigate. So far, no one had. But as the night wore on, the risk increased. More and more tracks were appearing in the snow, the marks of dozens of men crawling toward the trees. The pristine white surface was becoming a roadmap of the escape. Williams could only hope that the guards would not look too closely. At 3:00 a.m., the 50th man emerged from the tunnel. His name was Flight Lieutenant Denise Street, a 26-year-old British pilot who had been captured during a bombing raid over Essen. Street was traveling with a partner, Flight Lieutenant Arnold Christensen, a Norwegian pilot who would follow him out minutes later. Their plan was to head south toward Czechoslovakia, then cross into neutral Switzerland. They had forged papers identifying them as Norwegian workers traveling to new jobs in Munich. They carried a small amount of German currency, a compass hidden in a button, and enough food for 3 days. Street reached the tree line and paused, waiting for Christensen to emerge. When his partner appeared, a dark shape crawling through the snow, Street waved silently, and the two men set off together into the darkness. They would walk for nearly 18 hours before being captured at a railway station in Czechoslovakia. Behind them, the escape continued. Flight Lieutenant Bernard Schadehauer emerged at 3:15 a.m. A free French pilot who had escaped France after the German occupation, Schadehauer was one of the most determined men in the camp. He had volunteered for the most dangerous route, traveling by train through Berlin itself, then north toward the port of Stettin, where he hoped to stow away on a ship to Sweden. His partner for the journey was Squadron Leader Roger Bushell. The two men had agreed to meet at the Sagan railway station and travel together. Bushell had already been waiting for over 4 hours. When Schadehauer finally arrived, the two men embraced briefly, then walked into the station as if they were ordinary German citizens catching an early morning train. No one looked at them twice. By 4:00 a.m., 67 men had escaped. Inside Hut 104, the remaining escapers were growing increasingly anxious. Dawn was approaching. The window for escape was closing. Men who had been assigned numbers in the 70s and 80s realized they might not make it out at all. Flight Lieutenant Harry Marshall, who was coordinating movement from the barrack to the tunnel entrance, made a difficult decision. He began sending men down the shaft in pairs rather than one at a time, hopping to speed up the process. It worked, but only slightly. The tunnel was simply too long, too narrow, and too fragile to accommodate faster movement. Every attempt to rush resulted in delays, stuck trolleys, collapsed sections, men freezing at the exit. At 4:30 a.m., the 73rd man emerged from the tunnel. His name was Flight Lieutenant Lawrence Revel Carter, a British bomber pilot who had been shot down over Cologne in 1942. Revel Carter was tall, over 6 feet, and the narrow tunnel had been agony for him. His shoulders had scraped against the walls the entire way. His knees were raw from crawling. But he had made it. He crawled through the snow toward the trees, moving as quickly as his exhausted body would allow. The first hint of gray was appearing on the eastern horizon. Dawn was coming. Revel Carter had escaped just in time. At 4:45 a.m., Flight Lieutenant Keith Ogilvie descended into the shaft. Ogilvie was a Canadian pilot, number 74 on the escape list. He had waited all night for his turn, watching as man after man disappeared down the hole beneath the stove. Now, finally, it was his chance. He reached the bottom of the shaft and began crawling forward. The tunnel stretched ahead of him, dimly lit by the electric bulbs, narrowing into darkness. Behind him, 2 more men were waiting to descend, numbers 75 and 76. Their names were Flight Lieutenant Mick Shand and Flight Lieutenant Roy Langlois. They would be the last men to escape. What none of them knew was that, at that very moment, a German guard was walking along the perimeter fence. His name was Unteroffizier Gerhard Breithaupt. He was not looking for escaped prisoners. He was simply completing his routine patrol, walking the same route he had walked every night for months. His flashlight swept lazily across the snow, illuminating the fence posts, the warning wire, the trampled ground where prisoners had walked during the day. And then at precisely 4:55 a.m., Breithaupt's flashlight caught something unusual. Tracks in the snow, many tracks, leading from the direction of the camp toward the forest. Breithaupt stopped. He frowned. He followed the tracks with his flashlight, tracing them from the fence line toward the trees. And then he saw it. A dark hole in the snow, and inside that hole, a face. It was Flight Lieutenant Mick Shand, number 75, who had just reached the exit shaft and was preparing to climb the ladder. For a single frozen moment, the German guard and the British prisoner stared at each other in mutual disbelief. Then Breithaupt raised his rifle and began shouting. The great escape was over. Within seconds, sirens were wailing across Stalag Luft III. Guards poured out of their barracks, rifles in hand, dogs barking at their heels. Searchlights that had been sweeping lazily across the compound suddenly focused on the forest beyond the fence. At the tunnel exit, Shand and Langlois had no choice but to surrender. They emerged from the hole with their hands raised, blinking in the glare of the flashlights. Inside the tunnel, chaos erupted. Men who had been crawling toward freedom suddenly found themselves trapped, hundreds of feet of narrow passage between them and the exit, with no way to turn around. Flight Lieutenant Keith Ogilvy, who had been the 74th man out, had reached the trees just moments before the alarm sounded. He heard the sirens, saw the searchlights swinging toward the forest, and ran. Behind him, Shand and Langlois were being dragged from the tunnel at gunpoint. But Ogilvy kept running. He was the last man to escape Stalag Luft III through Tunnel Harry. Inside Hut 104, the remaining escapers heard the sirens and knew immediately what had happened. Flight Lieutenant Harry Marshall ordered the men still in the tunnel to reverse course, a nearly impossible task in the narrow passage. Men crawled backward over each other, their civilian suits tearing against the rough wooden walls, their forged documents crumpling in their pockets. The shaft beneath the stove became a bottleneck. Men emerged one by one, gasping for air, their faces streaked with sand and sweat. They stripped off their civilian clothing as quickly as possible, stuffing suits and documents into hiding places throughout the barracks. By the time the German guards burst through the door of Hut 104, the remaining prisoners were sitting calmly in their bunks, wearing their standard-issue pajamas, looking for all the world like men who had been asleep all night. The guards were not fooled. Hauptmann Hans Pieber, the German officer in charge of the North Compound, stood at the entrance of Hut 104, his face pale with disbelief. He had personally supervised this compound. He had personally assured his superiors that escape was impossible. And now 76 men were gone. Pieber ordered an immediate head count. Prisoners were roused from every barrack and assembled on the parade ground in the freezing pre-dawn darkness. Guards moved among them with flashlights, counting and recounting. The number came back the same every time. 76 prisoners are missing. As the sun rose over Stalag Luft III on the morning of March 25, 1944, the largest manhunt in Nazi Germany's history was about to begin. Within hours, over 70,000 German soldiers, policemen, Gestapo agents, Hitler Youth members, and Home Guard militia would be mobilized to hunt for the escaped prisoners. Roadblocks would be established on every major highway. Railway stations would be flooded with armed guards checking papers. Farms, factories, and private homes would be searched without warning. The escaped prisoners, meanwhile, were scattered across the frozen German countryside, traveling by train, by foot, by bicycle, by stolen car. Some moved in pairs, others traveled alone. A few had already crossed into Czechoslovakia. One had nearly reached the Swiss border. They knew the Germans would be hunting them. They knew the odds of reaching safety were slim. But they also knew they had accomplished something extraordinary. 76 men, Allied officers from Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Poland, Czechoslovakia, France, Norway, Belgium, Greece, and South Africa, had crawled through a tunnel 330 feet long and emerged, however briefly, as free men. For most of them, that freedom would last only hours. For 50 of them, it would end in front of a firing squad. But in that moment, in those first hours of March 25, 1944, they were still running. And the world would never forget what they had done. By 6:00 a.m. on March 25, 1944, the telephone lines across Nazi Germany were burning with frantic messages. The commandant of Stalag Luft III, Oberst Friedrich Wilhelm von Lindener-Wildau, had personally informed Berlin of the mass escape. His voice had been steady, but his hands had trembled as he held the receiver. 76 Allied prisoners had escaped from the most secure Luftwaffe camp in the Reich. It was the largest prison break in German military history. And someone would have to answer for it. Within hours, the highest levels of the Nazi leadership had been informed. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the German Armed Forces High Command, received the report at his headquarters. Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler was notified at his office in Berlin, and by mid-morning, the news had reached the Wolf's Lair, Adolf Hitler's military headquarters in East Prussia. Hitler's reaction was volcanic. According to witnesses present in the room, the Führer flew into one of his legendary rages. He screamed. He pounded the table. He demanded to know how such a catastrophic security failure was possible. But more than anger, Hitler felt something else: fear. The timing of the escape could not have been worse. The Allied invasion of Western Europe was expected within months. The Eastern Front was collapsing. German cities were being bombed around the clock. And now, 76 trained Allied officers, men who could fly aircraft, gather intelligence, and rejoin the fight, were loose somewhere in the Reich. Hitler made a decision that would shock even his own generals. Every escaped prisoner, he ordered, would be shot upon recapture. It was Himmler who convinced him to modify the order slightly. Executing all 76 men, Himmler argued, would create an international incident. The Allies would surely retaliate against German prisoners held in Britain and America. The neutral nations, Switzerland, Sweden, Spain, would be outraged. World opinion would turn even more decisively against Germany. Instead, Himmler proposed a compromise. More than half of the recaptured prisoners, at least 50 men, would be executed. The murders would be disguised as shootings during escape attempts. The bodies would be cremated immediately to destroy evidence. Hitler agreed. The order was issued to the Gestapo, the Nazi secret police. It bypassed the military chain of command entirely. The Luftwaffe, which had administered Stalag Luft III, would have no say in the matter. The 50 men were already marked for death. They just didn't know it yet. Meanwhile, the largest manhunt in German history was underway. The operation was codenamed Großfahndung, literally, nationwide alert. It was the highest level of search protocol in Nazi Germany, reserved only for the most serious threats to state security. Within 12 hours of the escape, over 70,000 personnel had been mobilized across the Reich. Regular Wehrmacht soldiers established roadblocks on every major highway leading out of Silesia. They stopped every vehicle, cars, trucks, buses, horse-drawn carts, and demanded papers from every passenger. Any man who could not immediately prove his identity was detained for questioning. Railway police flooded the train stations. Plainclothes Gestapo agents mingled with ordinary passengers, watching for anyone who seemed nervous, anyone who spoke German with a foreign accent, anyone whose documents looked slightly irregular. Hitler Youth units were dispatched to patrol rural areas, searching barns, haystacks, and abandoned buildings. Home Guard militia knocked on doors in every village within 50 miles of Sagan, questioning farmers and shopkeepers about any strangers they might have seen. The Luftwaffe itself contributed aircraft to the search, reconnaissance planes that flew low over the countryside, scanning for groups of men moving on foot through the snow-covered fields. And at the center of it all, the Gestapo coordinated everything. Reports flowed into their regional headquarters from across the Reich, tips from informants, sightings by local police, arrests at border crossings. The net was closing. The first recaptures came within hours of the escape. Flight Lieutenant Johannes Gauss and Flight Lieutenant Rupert Stevens were caught at Sagan railway station before dawn. They had arrived too early, before the first train to Breslau had departed, and a suspicious policeman had asked to see their papers. The forgeries were excellent, but when Gauss was asked a simple question about his supposed employer in Breslau, he hesitated for just a moment too long. That hesitation was enough. By noon on March 25th, 15 men had been recaptured. By nightfall, the number had risen to 23. Some were caught at railway stations, their forged documents scrutinized by increasingly paranoid guards. Others were stopped at roadblocks, unable to explain why they were traveling through the countryside in civilian clothes. A few were betrayed by German civilians who noticed strangers in their villages and reported them to the police. Flight Lieutenant Michael Shand and Flight Lieutenant Roy Langlois, the 75th and 76th men through the tunnel, had been captured immediately at the tunnel exit. They were the first to be taken back to Stalag Luft III, where they were thrown into solitary confinement. But they were also, ironically, among the lucky ones. They had been captured by the military. The men captured by the Gestapo would not be so fortunate. Squadron Leader Roger Bushell and Flight Lieutenant Bernard Schaedhauer had made it further than most. Their plan had been audacious: travel by train directly through Berlin, then north to the Baltic port of Stettin, where they would attempt to board a ship to Sweden. Bushell spoke perfect German. Schaedhauer was French but could pass as a foreign worker. Their forged papers were among the best produced by the Escape Committee. For nearly 48 hours, the plan worked perfectly. Bushell and Schaedhauer boarded a train at Sagan Station in the pre-dawn darkness of March 25th. They traveled west, then north, changing trains twice. They passed through Berlin without incident, mingling with the crowds of workers and soldiers that filled the bombed-out railway stations. By the evening of March 26th, they had reached Saarbrücken, a city near the French border. They were so close to freedom. But at the Saarbrücken railway station, a young Gestapo officer named Dr. Leopold Spann noticed something unusual about the two well-dressed travelers waiting on the platform. Their German was flawless. Their papers were in order, but something about their manner, a certain tension, a certain wariness, caught Spann's attention. He approached them and asked a series of casual questions. Where were they traveling? What was their business? Who was their employer? Bushell answered smoothly, without hesitation. But Schaedhauer, exhausted, nervous, and not as fluent in German as his partner, made a small mistake. He used the wrong verb tense. It was such a tiny error, a grammatical slip that most Germans would never have noticed. But Spann was trained to notice such things. He was trained to detect foreigners posing as Germans. He asked to see their papers again. And this time he looked more carefully. Within an hour, Bushell and Schaedhauer were in Gestapo custody. Their true identities were confirmed. The mastermind of the Great Escape, the man the Germans called Big X, had been caught. Roger Bushell would never see England again. As the hours passed, the list of recaptured prisoners grew longer. Flight Lieutenant Denise Street and Flight Lieutenant Arnold Christensen were caught at a railway station in Czechoslovakia, just miles from the border with Hungary. Flight Lieutenant Jimmy Katnack and Flight Lieutenant Arnold Christensen were arrested at the Danish border, having traveled nearly 500 miles by train. Flight Lieutenant Tony Bethel was captured hiding in a haystack near Görlitz, betrayed by a farmer who had seen him crossing the fields. By March 28th, 3 days after the escape, only 11 men remained at large. And then, one by one, they too were caught. Flight Lieutenant Bob Nelson was arrested at a small railway station in Bavaria. Flight Lieutenant Cookie Long was captured near the Swiss border, within sight of freedom. Flight Lieutenant Hank Birkeland was caught trying to cross a frozen river into Czechoslovakia. By March 31st, 73 of the 76 escaped prisoners had been recaptured. Only 3 men had made it to safety. Their names were Per Bergsland, Jens Muller, and Bram van der Stok. Bergsland and Muller were Norwegian pilots who had escaped together. They had traveled north by train to the port of Stettin, where they had located a Swedish merchant ship and convinced the captain to smuggle them aboard. On March 30th, 1944, they arrived in Stockholm, free men. Van der Stok was a Dutch pilot who had taken the most difficult route of all. He had traveled south by train through Germany, crossed into France, connected with the French resistance, and been smuggled over the Pyrenees Mountains into Spain. From there, he made his way to Gibraltar and eventually back to England. 3 men out of 76. A success rate of less than 4%. But the story of the Great Escape was far from over. For the 73 men who had been recaptured, a new nightmare was about to begin. In the days following the escape, the recaptured prisoners were scattered across dozens of prisons and detention centers throughout the Reich. Some were held by the military, by the Luftwaffe or the Wehrmacht, in accordance with the Geneva Convention. These men were interrogated, sometimes roughly, but they were treated as prisoners of war. Others were held by the Gestapo, and the Gestapo did not follow the Geneva Convention. The orders from Berlin were explicit. At least 50 of the recaptured prisoners were to be executed. The killings were to be carried out by local Gestapo units. The bodies were to be cremated immediately, and official reports were to state that the prisoners had been shot while attempting to escape. It was murder disguised as battlefield justice. The Gestapo began selecting their victims. Roger Bushell was on the list, marked personally by Hitler himself. Bernard Schaedhauer, his traveling companion, was also selected. So were dozens of others: British pilots, Canadian navigators, Australian bombardiers, Polish officers, Czech resistance fighters, Norwegian agents. Men who had risked everything for freedom. Men who had committed no crime, except trying to return to the fight. In the first week of April 1944, the executions began. Small groups of prisoners were taken from their cells, loaded into cars, and driven to remote locations in the German countryside. They were told they were being transferred to other camps. They were told they were being returned to Stalag Luft III. They were told many things. None of them was true. Squadron Leader Roger Bushell was executed on March 29, 1944. He and Bernard Schaedhauer had been held at Gestapo headquarters in Saarbrücken for 3 days. They had been interrogated repeatedly, questioned about the escape organization, about the tunnel construction, about the identities of their helpers. Bushell had said nothing of value. On the morning of the 29th, 2 Gestapo officers, Emil Schulz and Walter Breithaupt, informed Bushell and Schaedhauer that they were being transferred to another facility. The 2 prisoners were placed in the back of a black sedan and driven out of the city. The car traveled along a quiet country road, passing through small villages and frozen farmland. Bushell sat in silence, watching the German countryside roll past the window. He had seen so much of this country, as a prisoner, as an escaper, as a hunted man. Perhaps he knew what was coming. Perhaps he sensed that this was not a transfer. After approximately 30 minutes, the car pulled to the side of the road. Schulz turned to face the 2 prisoners and told them to step outside. He said they needed to relieve themselves before continuing the journey. Bushell and Schaedhauer climbed out of the car. They were standing on the edge of an empty field, surrounded by bare trees and patches of melting snow. There were no buildings in sight, no witnesses. Schulz drew his pistol and shot Roger Bushell in the back of the head. Schaedhauer turned to run, but Breithaupt was faster. A second shot echoed across the empty field. Both men fell face down in the mud. The bodies were loaded back into the car and driven to the nearest crematorium. By nightfall, Squadron Leader Roger Bushell, the mastermind of the Great Escape, the man who had dedicated 18 months of his life to planning the most audacious prison break in history, had been reduced to ashes. He was 33 years old. The official Gestapo report stated that Bushell and Schaedhauer had been shot while attempting to escape. It was a lie, and it was a lie that would be repeated 49 more times. The killings continued throughout the first 2 weeks of April. Flight Lieutenant James Catnack was executed near Kiel on March 29th. He had made it further than almost anyone, over 500 miles by train to the Danish border, before being captured. He was shot on a country road, just like Bushell. Flight Lieutenant Arnold Christensen was killed the same day, at the same location. He had been Catnack's traveling partner throughout the escape. Flight Lieutenant Halada Espelid and Flight Lieutenant Nils Fuglesang, 2 Norwegian pilots who had nearly reached the Swedish border, were executed near Frankfurt on March 30th. The pattern was always the same. Prisoners would be taken from their cells early in the morning. They would be told they were being transferred or interrogated or returned to Stalag Luft III. They would be placed in cars driven by Gestapo officers, always 2 officers, always armed. The cars would drive to remote locations, forest roads, country lanes, abandoned quarries. The prisoners would be ordered to step outside, and then without warning they would be shot from behind. Sometimes the executions were instantaneous, a single bullet to the back of the head. Other times the killings were more prolonged. Some prisoners were shot multiple times, others were beaten before being killed. But the result was always the same. The bodies were cremated immediately, usually within hours of the killing. The ashes were placed in urns and sent back to Stalag Luft III, where they would eventually be delivered to the prisoners who had remained behind. 50 urns, 50 sets of ashes, 50 men who had simply wanted to go home. Flight Lieutenant John Poe was executed on March 30th near Breslau. Poe was a New Zealander, a Maori pilot who had joined the Royal New Zealand Air Force at the outbreak of war. He had been shot down over Germany in 1941 and had spent 3 years as a prisoner, dreaming of freedom. He had been assigned number 47 in the escape sequence. He had crawled through Tunnel Harry in the early hours of March 25th, emerging into the frozen night with forged papers identifying him as a Czech factory worker. He had made it nearly 200 miles before being captured at a railway station in Görlitz. The Gestapo officers who killed him were named Lux and Weixerek. They drove Poe to a quiet road outside Breslau and ordered him to step out of the car to urinate. When Poe turned his back, Lux shot him. The bullet struck Poe in the spine. He fell forward but did not die immediately. He lay in the road, paralyzed, gasping for breath. Weixerek walked over and fired a second shot into his head. John Poe was 30 years old. He had a wife waiting for him in New Zealand. He would never see her again. Flight Lieutenant Thomas Kirby Green was executed on April 6th, along with his escape partner, Flight Lieutenant Gordon Kidder. Kirby Green was British, an experienced pilot who had been captured during a reconnaissance mission over North Africa. Kidder was Canadian, from St. Catharines, Ontario. They had escaped together, traveling south toward Czechoslovakia with the intention of crossing into Yugoslavia and eventually reaching Allied lines in Italy. They had been captured near the Czechoslovak border, just 30 miles from their intended crossing point. The two men were driven to a remote forest road near Zeelin. The Gestapo officers, their names were Zacharias and Nippelberg, ordered them out of the car. Kirby Green and Kidder stood side by side in the cold morning air. Perhaps they knew what was coming. Perhaps they looked at each other one final time. The shots came without warning. Both men fell. Kirby Green was still alive when he hit the ground. He tried to crawl toward the trees, his fingers clawing at the frozen earth. Nippelberg walked over and fired 2 more shots into his back. The bodies were loaded into the car and driven to the crematorium at Brno. Not all of the condemned men died passively. Flight Lieutenant Denise Street was executed near Sagan on March 31st. He had been captured almost immediately after the escape at a railway station in Czechoslovakia. When the Gestapo officers ordered him out of the car on a deserted forest road, Street refused to move. He knew what was happening. He had heard rumors in the prison cells, whispered stories of other prisoners being taken away and never returning. He had seen the cold efficiency of the Gestapo officers who came for him that morning. He would not make it easy for them. "If you're going to kill me," Street said, "you'll have to do it here." The officers hesitated. Their orders were to stage the killings as escape attempts, to shoot the prisoners outside the car, away from any witnesses. Shooting a man inside a vehicle would create complications. But Street did not move. Finally, one of the officers leaned into the car, pressed his pistol against Street's temple, and fired. The body was dragged out and left on the roadside while the car was cleaned. Then it was driven to the crematorium. Denise Street was 26 years old. The killings continued for 2 weeks. Flight Lieutenant Edgar Humphreys, executed near Sagan on March 31st. Flight Lieutenant Charles Hall, executed near Sagan on March 31st. Flight Lieutenant Brian Evans, executed near Sagan on March 31st. Flight Lieutenant Władimir Kalinowski, a Polish pilot who had escaped his homeland after the German invasion, was executed near Hirschberg on March 31st. Flight Lieutenant Patrick Langford, executed near Görlitz on March 31st. Flight Lieutenant George McGill, executed near Görlitz on March 31st. Flight Lieutenant Clement Magar, executed near Görlitz on March 31st. Flight Lieutenant Harold Milford, executed near Breslau on April 6th. The list went on and on. 50 names, 50 men, 50 murders. Back at Stalag Luft III, the remaining prisoners knew something was terribly wrong. For days after the escape, they had heard nothing about the recaptured men. Normally, prisoners who were caught after an escape attempt were returned to the camp within days, punished with solitary confinement, perhaps, but alive. This time, no one came back. On April 6, 1944, the camp commandant, Oberst von Lindener-Wild, received orders from Berlin to inform the prisoners of what had happened. Von Lindener was a career military officer, not a Nazi ideologue. He had run Stalag Luft III with relative fairness, respecting the Geneva Convention and treating his prisoners as fellow soldiers rather than enemies. He had been appalled by the escape. It had ended his career and would likely result in his court-martial. But he had not expected this. The orders from Berlin stated that 41 of the recaptured prisoners had been shot while attempting to escape. 41 men. Von Lindener knew immediately that it was murder. No escape attempt in history had resulted in so many deaths. It was impossible. It was monstrous. But he had no choice except to deliver the news. On the afternoon of April 6th, the senior British officer at Stalag Luft III, Group Captain Herbert Massey, was summoned to the commandant's office. Massey was a veteran of the First World War, a decorated pilot who had been shot down over France in 1942 and captured. He walked with a cane due to injuries sustained in his crash. He was respected by both the prisoners and the German guards. When he entered von Lindener's office, the commandant was seated behind his desk, his face pale and drawn. "I have been instructed to inform you," von Lindener said, "that 41 of the officers who escaped have been shot while resisting arrest or attempting further escape after being recaptured." Massey stared at him in disbelief. 41 men shot while escaping. Von Lindener said nothing. His silence spoke volumes. "That is murder," Massey said quietly. "You know that is murder." The commandant looked down at his desk. He could not meet Massey's eyes. "I am simply delivering the message I was ordered to deliver," he said. "The ashes of the deceased will be returned to the camp in due course." Massey stood in silence for a long moment. Then he turned and walked out of the office. The news spread through Stalag Luft III like wildfire. 41 men shot while escaping. The prisoners knew immediately that it was a lie. These were trained officers, experienced escapers, intelligent men. They would not have attempted to flee after being recaptured by armed Gestapo agents. They would have known the odds were hopeless. No, this was something else entirely. This was execution. In the days that followed, the number of dead continued to rise, first 41, then 47, then finally 50. 50 men, murdered in cold blood by the Gestapo. Among the dead were some of the most beloved figures in the camp. Roger Bushell, Big X himself, the man who had planned the entire operation. Tim Whalen, the brilliant forger who had created hundreds of identity documents. Al Haig, who had built the compasses. Henry Birkeland, Gordon Kidder, James Catnack, Tom Kirby Green. Men who had worked together for over a year. Men who had shared bunks, shared food, shared hope. All gone. The reaction among the prisoners was a mixture of grief, rage, and cold determination. Flight Lieutenant Sidney Dowes, who had survived the escape, later described the atmosphere in the camp. "There was a terrible silence when we heard. We all knew what had happened. We all knew it was murder. Some men wept. Others sat in stunned silence. But beneath the grief, there was something else, a burning anger, a promise that those responsible would be held accountable. The prisoners held a memorial service in the camp theater. A wooden plaque was carved with the names of the 50 dead men. It was placed against a wall, surrounded by wildflowers picked from the edges of the compound. Men who had been enemies of Germany before the escape now became something more. They became witnesses. They memorized the names of the dead. They recorded every detail they could learn about the killings, dates, locations, and the names of Gestapo officers mentioned in rumors. They smuggled messages to the Red Cross, to neutral diplomats, to anyone who would listen. The world, they vowed, would know what had happened at Stalag Luft III. And one day, the murderers would pay. Of the 76 men who crawled through Tunnel Harry on the night of March 24, 1944, 23 survived. 3 of them, Per Bergsland, Jens Mueller, and Bram van der Stok, had reached neutral territory. They were the only ones who achieved true freedom. The other 20 were recaptured, but, for reasons that remained unclear for years, were not selected for execution. They were returned to prisoner-of-war camps, where they spent the remaining months of the war behind barbed wire. Their survival was a matter of pure chance. Flight Lieutenant Paul Royal was one of the lucky ones. Royal was an Australian pilot who had been shot down over Germany in 1940. He had been a prisoner for nearly 4 years when he crawled through Tunnel Harry as number 43 in the escape sequence. He was captured within 48 hours at a railway station near Sagan. He was interrogated by the Gestapo for 3 days, questioned about the tunnel, about the escape organization, about Roger Bushell. He told them nothing. On the 4th day, instead of being loaded into a car and driven to a remote location, Royal was transferred to a military prison. From there, he was sent to another stalag, a camp for army prisoners rather than airmen. He never knew why he was spared. He never knew whose name had been on the list instead of his. He spent the rest of the war wondering. Flight Lieutenant Bob Nelson was another survivor. Nelson was a British pilot who had been captured during a bombing raid over Bremen in 1941. He had worked in the forgery section of the escape organization, creating dozens of identity documents under Tim Whalen's supervision. He escaped through Tunnel Harry as number 52. He traveled by train toward the Swiss border, making it nearly 300 miles before being captured at a roadblock near Munich. For 3 weeks, Nelson sat in a Gestapo cell, waiting to learn his fate. He heard the rumors, prisoners being taken away, prisoners never returning. He prepared himself for death. But the order never came. Instead, Nelson was transferred to Stalag wwiihistory at Moosburg, a massive camp in Bavaria that held thousands of Allied prisoners. He remained there until April 1945, when the camp was liberated by the American 14th Armored Division. When he walked through the gates as a free man, his first thought was of the 50 friends who had not been so fortunate. "I survived by accident," Nelson said later. "There was no reason I lived and they died. It was simply luck, terrible random luck." Flight Lieutenant Sidney Dowes was perhaps the luckiest of all. Dowes was a British pilot who had been captured during a reconnaissance mission over Norway in 1942. He had been one of the key organizers of the escape, working closely with Roger Bushell on logistics and planning. He escaped through Tunnel Harry as number 39. He was captured within hours, one of the first to be recaptured, at a railway station just outside Sagan. Given his prominent role in the escape organization, Dowes should have been marked for execution. He was exactly the type of prisoner the Nazis wanted to eliminate: experienced, resourceful, and capable of causing more trouble in the future. But through a bureaucratic error, Dowes's name was never added to the execution list. The Gestapo officers who captured him did not realize his importance. He was processed as an ordinary recaptured prisoner and sent to a military detention center rather than Gestapo custody. By the time the mistake was discovered, Dowes had already been transferred out of Gestapo jurisdiction. Killing him would have required additional paperwork, additional approvals, additional complications. So they let him live. POWs spent the rest of the war in various prison camps, eventually ending up at Sachsenhausen concentration camp near Berlin. He was liberated by Soviet forces in April 1945. He weighed less than 100 pounds, but he was alive. The 20 survivors carried the weight of their survival for the rest of their lives. They had crawled through the same tunnel as the 50 dead men. They had worn the same forged papers, carried the same homemade compasses, followed the same escape routes. The only difference between them and their murdered comrades was the random chance of which Gestapo unit had captured them, which bureaucrat had processed their paperwork, which name had appeared on which list. Flight Lieutenant Bertram James, who survived the escape and was returned to Stalag Luft III, described the feeling in later years. "We all felt guilty in a way. Why did we live when so many others died? There was no logic to it, no reason. Roger Bushell was worth 10 of me, he should have survived. Tim Whalen, Al Haig, all those brilliant men, they should have survived, but they didn't, and we did, and we had to live with that for the rest of our lives." The survivors became the keepers of the flame. They remembered the names of the dead. They told the stories. They made sure the world never forgot what had happened in those frozen fields and lonely forest roads in the spring of 1944. And they waited for justice. Back at Stalag Luft III, the remaining prisoners lived under a cloud of grief and anger. The wooden plaque bearing the names of the 50 murdered men became a shrine. Prisoners would stand before it in silence, reading the names, remembering the faces. Some men prayed, others simply stood and stared. The Germans, for their part, seemed almost embarrassed by what had happened. Oberst von Lindener Wildau, the camp commandant, was relieved of his command shortly after the escape. He was court-martialed for negligence and sentenced to a year in prison. It was a light punishment, given the magnitude of the security failure, but von Lindener had powerful friends in the Luftwaffe who protected him from harsher penalties. He was replaced by Oberst Braun, a stricter commander who immediately implemented new security measures. The remaining tunnels were destroyed. The barracks were searched more frequently. Prisoners were watched more closely. But the spirit of resistance at Stalag Luft III was not broken. If anything, the murders had strengthened it. The prisoners continued to gather intelligence, to plan future escapes, to prepare for the day when the war would end and they would be free. They knew that day was coming. The Allied armies were advancing on every front. Germany was collapsing. And when that day came, they would have stories to tell. The war ground on through the summer and autumn of 1944. In June, the Allies landed at Normandy, the long-awaited invasion of Western Europe. In the east, the Soviet Red Army launched Operation Bagration, destroying an entire German army group and driving deep into Poland. By January 1945, the Eastern Front had reached the outskirts of Germany itself. Stalag Luft III lay directly in the path of the Soviet advance. On January 27, 1945, with the sound of Soviet artillery audible in the distance, the Germans ordered the evacuation of the camp. Over 10,000 Allied prisoners were forced to march westward through the frozen German countryside, away from the approaching Red Army. It was one of the most brutal experiences of the war. The temperature was well below freezing. Snow covered the roads. The prisoners had been given only hours to prepare, and many had inadequate clothing and no food. They marched for days, sleeping in barns and open fields, watching their comrades collapse from exhaustion and hypothermia. Hundreds of men died during what became known as the Long March, or the Death March. But the survivors kept walking. Among them were the 20 men who had escaped through Tunnel Harry and lived. They marched alongside the hundreds of others who had remained behind, who had watched the 50 urns arrive at the camp, who had stood before the wooden memorial and sworn that the murders would not be forgotten. They marched toward freedom, and in May 1945, that freedom finally came. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8, 1945. The war in Europe was over. Across the continent, Allied prisoners were liberated from camps, prisons, and forced labor facilities. They streamed toward assembly points, toward hospitals, toward ships and aircraft that would carry them home. The survivors of Stalag Luft III were among them. Flight Lieutenant Sidney Dowes was liberated from Sachsenhausen concentration camp by Soviet forces on April 21, 1945. He was so weak he could barely walk. Flight Lieutenant Paul Royal was liberated from Stalag Wwiihistory by American forces on April 29, 1945. He weighed 40 pounds less than he had before the escape. Flight Lieutenant Bob Nelson was liberated the same day from the same camp. He had been a prisoner for nearly 4 years. One by one, the survivors made their way home, to Britain, to Canada, to Australia, to New Zealand, to Poland, to Czechoslovakia. They reunited with families who had spent years praying for their return. They tried to rebuild lives that had been shattered by captivity. But even in those first days of freedom, they carried the memory of the 50 men who had not come home. And they carried a burning desire for justice. The British government shared that desire. Even before the war ended, officials in London had begun collecting information about the Stalag Luft III murders. The testimony of survivors, the reports from neutral diplomats, the evidence gathered by prisoners inside the camp, all of it pointed to a systematic campaign of murder ordered at the highest levels of the Nazi regime. In September 1944, British Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden had issued a public statement condemning the killings. He warned that those responsible would be held accountable after the war. His Majesty's government must record their solemn protest against these cold-blooded acts of butchery, Eden declared. They will never cease in their efforts to collect the evidence to identify all those responsible. They are firmly resolved that these criminals shall be brought to exemplary justice. It was not an empty threat. In June 1945, just weeks after Germany's surrender, the Royal Air Force established a special investigation unit dedicated solely to solving the Stalag Luft III murders. The unit was commanded by Wing Commander Wilfred Bowes. Its mission was simple: find the killers. Wing Commander Wilfred Bowes arrived in occupied Germany in the summer of 1945 with a single-minded purpose. He would find the men who had murdered the 50 prisoners of Stalag Luft III. He would bring them to justice. And he would not stop until every last killer had been identified, captured, and punished. Bowes was a career RAF officer, a methodical, determined man who approached the investigation with the same precision he had once applied to planning bombing raids. He assembled a small team of investigators, requisitioned office space in the British occupation zone, and began collecting evidence. The task before him was immense. The murders had taken place across a vast geographic area, from Sagan in the east to Saarbrücken in the west, from Kiel in the north to Brno in the south. The killers were Gestapo agents, many of whom had fled, gone into hiding, or assumed false identities in the chaos of Germany's collapse. The Nazi bureaucracy had been designed for secrecy. Records had been destroyed. Witnesses had been intimidated into silence. The chain of command that had authorized the murders stretched all the way to Hitler's inner circle, to men who were now dead, in Allied custody, or hiding in the shadows of a shattered Reich. But Bowes had advantages, too. He had the testimony of the 20 survivors. He had the evidence collected by prisoners at Stalag Luft III. And he had the full weight of the British government behind him, determined to prove that war crimes would not go unpunished. The investigation began with the urns. 50 urns of ashes had been delivered to Stalag Luft III in the weeks following the murders. Each urn was labeled with a name, and each urn had been sent from a specific crematorium, a trail of paperwork that could be traced backward to the location of each killing. Bowes and his team mapped the crematoriums across Germany. They cross-referenced the dates on the urns with the dates of the killings. Slowly, methodically, they began to reconstruct the geography of the murders. The first break came in August 1945. A German prisoner awaiting trial for other war crimes mentioned something unusual during an interrogation. He had heard rumors whispers among former Gestapo officers about a series of killings in the spring of 1944. Allied prisoners, shot on country roads, cremated immediately. The prisoner did not know the details, but he knew a name. Kriminalkommissar Emil Schulz. POWs recognized the name immediately. Schulz had been one of the Gestapo officers present at the capture of Roger Bushell and Bernard Schädhor in Saarbrücken. The hunt was on. Emil Schulz was tracked down in September 1945. He was living under his own name in a small town in the British occupation zone, working as a laborer and hoping that his role in the murders had been forgotten. He was wrong. When British military police arrived at his door, Schulz initially denied any involvement in the killings. He claimed he had been a minor functionary, a desk officer, a man who simply followed orders. But POWs had evidence. Under interrogation, Schulz's story began to fall apart. He contradicted himself repeatedly. He could not explain his presence in Saarbrücken on the day of Bushell's capture. He could not account for his movements in the days that followed. Finally, confronted with witness testimony and documentary evidence, Schulz confessed. He admitted that he had been present when Roger Bushell and Bernard Schädhor were shot on a country road outside Saarbrücken. He admitted that he had fired one of the fatal shots. He admitted that he had helped load the bodies into the car and drive them to the crematorium. He claimed he had been following orders. It was a defense that would be repeated again and again in the months to come. Schulz's confession led to more names, more arrests, more confessions. The network of killers began to unravel. Kriminalkommissar Walter Breithaupt, Schulz's partner in the Bushell murder, was arrested in October 1945. He confessed almost immediately, providing detailed testimony about the killing and the orders he had received from Berlin. Kriminalkommissar Johannes Post was arrested in November 1945. He had been responsible for the murders of several prisoners near Kiel, including Flight Lieutenant James Kattenack and Flight Lieutenant Arnold Christensen. Kriminalsekretär Oskar Schmidt was captured in December 1945. He had participated in the killings near Sagen. Kriminalkommissar Erich Zacharias was arrested in January 1946. He had murdered Flight Lieutenant Thomas Kirby Green and Flight Lieutenant Gordon Kidder near Zeelin in Czechoslovakia. One by one, the killers were found. Some were hiding in plain sight, living under their own names, convinced that no one would come for them. Others had fled to Austria, to South America, to the remote corners of Germany's shattered landscape. A few had committed suicide rather than face justice. But most were captured. By the end of 1946, POWs and his team had identified and arrested over 20 Gestapo officers directly involved in the murders. The question of who had ordered the killings proved more difficult to answer. The trail led upward through the Nazi hierarchy, through regional Gestapo chiefs, through the Reich Security Main Office in Berlin, through the offices of Heinrich Himmler and Ernst Kaltenbrunner. Himmler was dead. He had committed suicide after being captured by British forces in May 1945, biting down on a cyanide capsule before he could be interrogated. Kaltenbrunner, the head of the Reich Security Main Office and one of the highest-ranking SS officers to survive the war, was in custody at Nuremberg, awaiting trial for crimes against humanity. Documentary evidence presented at Nuremberg confirmed what POWs had suspected all along. The order to execute the 50 prisoners had come directly from Adolf Hitler. It had been transmitted through Himmler and Kaltenbrunner to regional Gestapo offices across Germany. Local Gestapo chiefs had selected the victims and assigned officers to carry out the killings. It was murder by bureaucracy, systematic, deliberate, and authorized at the highest levels of the Nazi state. Kaltenbrunner was convicted at Nuremberg and hanged on October 16, 1946. But he was not the only one who would face the hangman's noose. The trials of the direct killers began in 1947. The first trial was held in Hamburg in July 1947. 18 defendants stood in the dock, Gestapo officers accused of participating in the murders of the 50 prisoners. The evidence against them was overwhelming. Survivor testimony, confessions, documentary records, photographs of the cremation urns, death certificates forged by the Gestapo to disguise the murders as escape attempts. The defendants offered various defenses. Some claimed they had been following orders, that they had no choice but to obey instructions from Berlin. Others claimed they had been low-level functionaries, mere drivers or guards, not actual triggermen. A few denied any involvement at all, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. The court rejected these defenses. Following orders, the judges ruled, was not a valid excuse for murder. Every man who participated in the killings, whether he pulled the trigger or simply drove the car, was guilty of war crimes. On September 3, 1947, the verdicts were announced. 14 of the 18 defendants were found guilty. 13 were sentenced to death. The executions took place at Hamelin Prison on February 27, 1948. 13 men were hanged that morning, one after another in a grim procession of justice. Among them was Kriminalkommissar Emil Schulz, who had shot Roger Bushell in the back of the head on a country road near Saarbrücken. Among them was Kriminalkommissar Johannes Post, who had murdered James Katnack and Arnold Christensen near Kiel. Among them was Kriminalkommissar Erich Zacharias, who had killed Thomas Kirby Green and Gordon Kidder near Zeeland. The hangings were conducted by the British executioner Albert Pierrepoint, who had also executed numerous Nazi war criminals at Nuremberg. Each execution took less than a minute. The bodies were buried in unmarked graves within the prison grounds. It was not revenge. It was justice. After nearly 4 years, from the night of the escape in March 1944 to the hangings in February 1948, the murderers had finally been held accountable. But the investigation was not over. Wing Commander Bose continued his work for another 2 years. More killers were identified, more arrests were made, more trials were held. A second trial took place in 1948, resulting in additional convictions. A third trial followed in 1949. By the time the investigation officially concluded in 1948, a total of 21 men had been executed for their roles in the murders. Several killers, however, escaped justice entirely. Some had died during the war, killed in combat, or in the bombing raids that devastated German cities. Others had committed suicide before they could be captured. A handful managed to flee Germany altogether, disappearing into South America or the Middle East with the help of Nazi escape networks. They lived out their lives in anonymity, never facing trial for their crimes. And a few were simply never found. Despite years of searching, despite thousands of hours of investigation, not every killer was brought to justice. Some remained at large until their natural deaths, decades after the war. It was an imperfect outcome, a reminder that even the most determined pursuit of justice cannot always succeed. But what Bose and his team accomplished was nonetheless remarkable. They had tracked down the killers across a continent in ruins. They had pieced together evidence from fragments and whispers. They had proven that the murders were not random acts of violence, but a coordinated campaign of execution ordered by the highest levels of the Nazi regime. And they had ensured that most of the guilty paid with their lives. The investigation into the Stalag Luft III murders remains one of the most successful war crimes investigations in history. Of the approximately 80 Gestapo officers and officials involved in the killings, over 60 were eventually identified. 21 were executed. 17 others received prison sentences ranging from 10 years to life. Wing Commander Wilfred Bose was awarded the Order of the British Empire for his leadership of the investigation. He remained in the RAF until his retirement, never speaking publicly about his work. But those who worked with him remembered his determination, his refusal to give up, his insistence that every victim deserved justice, his quiet conviction that the 50 murdered men would not be forgotten. "They were trying to get home," Bose once said. "That was their only crime, and for that they were shot in the back and burned to ashes. Someone had to answer for that. Someone had to pay." Someone did. The war had been over for 3 years when the last of the murderers was hanged. But for the families of the 50 dead men, the grief would never truly end. In towns and villages across Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Norway, and a dozen other nations, mothers and fathers, wives and children, brothers and sisters had received the terrible news in the spring of 1944. Their loved ones had escaped from a German prison camp. They had been recaptured. They had been shot. The official telegrams offered no details. The truth came later, in fragments, in whispered rumors, in the slow accumulation of evidence gathered by investigators and survivors. For many families, there was no body to bury. The remains of their loved ones had been reduced to ashes and placed in urns that remained in Germany, at a cemetery near the former site of Stalag Luft III. The families could not visit. They could not lay flowers on a grave. They could only remember and wonder what might have been. Mrs. Margaret Bushell, Roger's mother, received the news of her son's death in April 1944. She had already lost her husband years earlier. Now she had lost her only son, shot in the back on a German road, cremated before anyone could claim his body. She never fully recovered. "Roger was everything to me," she wrote in a letter to a family friend. "He was brave and brilliant and full of life, and they murdered him like a criminal. I will never understand it. I will never forgive it." She died in 1951, still grieving. In the years following the war, the survivors of the Great Escape worked tirelessly to ensure that their fallen comrades were not forgotten. Flight Lieutenant Sidney Dowes, who had survived both the escape and the concentration camp at Sachsenhausen, became one of the most vocal advocates for remembrance. He spoke at memorial services, gave interviews to journalists, and corresponded with the families of the dead. "We owe them everything," Dowes said in a 1950 interview. "They gave their lives trying to get home. The least we can do is remember their names." The survivors organized annual reunions, gathering each year on the anniversary of the escape to share memories, to toast fallen friends, and to keep the story alive. As the decades passed and their numbers dwindled, these reunions became increasingly poignant. A shrinking circle of old men who had once been young prisoners, who had once crawled through a tunnel into the frozen German night. Flight Lieutenant Bertram James attended nearly every reunion until his death in 2008. He was 92 years old, one of the last surviving escapers. "I think about them every day," James said in his final interview. "Roger, Tim, Al, all of them, they were my friends, and I never forgot what happened to them." The site of Stalag Luft III itself became a place of pilgrimage. After the war, the camp fell into ruins. The wooden barracks rotted and collapsed. The guard towers were torn down. The barbed wire rusted and disappeared into the undergrowth. But the tunnels remained, collapsed and filled with sand, but still present beneath the earth. In 1961, the Polish government, which now controlled the territory where the camp had stood, established a small museum at the site. A stone marker was erected near the location of the tunnel exit, commemorating the escape and the 50 men who died. The museum was modest at first, a single room with photographs, documents, and artifacts recovered from the camp. But over the decades, it grew. Today, the Stalag Luft III Museum receives thousands of visitors each year from around the world. They come to see the reconstructed barracks. They come to walk the perimeter where the fences once stood. They come to stand at the spot where 76 men emerged from the earth and took their first breaths of freedom. And they come to remember. The cemetery at Poznan, Poland, holds the remains of the 50 murdered men. After the war, the urns that had been delivered to Stalag Luft III were collected and transferred to a Commonwealth War Graves Commission cemetery. The men were reburied together, 50 graves arranged in neat rows, each marked with a white headstone bearing a name, a rank, a date of death, and the emblem of the nation they had served. Roger Bushell lies there. So does Bernard Shadehower. So do Thomas Kirby Green, Gordon Kidder, James Cattenack, Arnold Christensen, and 44 others. Every year on the anniversary of the escape, a memorial service is held at the cemetery. Diplomats, military officers, and family members gather to lay wreaths, to read the names of the dead, and to observe a moment of silence. The service is conducted in English and Polish, a reminder that the men buried here came from many nations, united by their service and their sacrifice. Flight Lieutenant John Williams, who had controlled the exit shaft on the night of the escape and survived the war, attended the memorial service at Poznan every year until his death in 1995. "I was standing at the top of that ladder when they came out," Williams recalled. "I touched their hands, I wished them luck, and then they walked into the darkness and I never saw most of them again." He paused, his voice breaking. 50 of them, 50 of my friends. I've spent my whole life wondering why I lived and they didn't." The story of the Great Escape entered the public consciousness gradually at first, then all at once. In 1950, Paul Brickhill, an Australian pilot who had been a prisoner at Stalag Luft III but had not participated in the escape due to claustrophobia, published a book titled The Great Escape. It was based on his own observations, the testimony of survivors, and the records collected during the war crimes investigations. The book became an international bestseller. Brickhill's account was meticulous and moving, a detailed reconstruction of the tunnel construction, the escape itself, and the murders that followed. It introduced the world to Roger Bushell, Wally Floody, Tim Whalen, and the hundreds of other prisoners who had contributed to the escape effort. For millions of readers, it was their first encounter with the story. And for the families of the dead, it was a validation, proof that their loved one's sacrifice had not been in vain. "When I read Paul's book," wrote the sister of Flight Lieutenant Harold Milford, "I wept, but I also felt proud. My brother had been part of something extraordinary. The world would know what he had done." The book remained in print for decades, translated into dozens of languages, read by generations of readers around the world. In 1963, the story reached an even wider audience. Hollywood producer Walter Mirisch acquired the film rights to Brickhill's book and assembled an all-star cast to bring the story to life. Steve McQueen, James Garner, Richard Attenborough, Charles Bronson, James Coburn, Donald Pleasence. The resulting film, titled simply The Great Escape, became one of the most beloved war movies ever made. The film took considerable liberties with the historical record. It invented characters, combined real individuals into composite figures, and added dramatic sequences. Most famously, Steve McQueen's iconic motorcycle chase. That never happened in reality. But at its core, the film captured the spirit of the escape. The ingenuity, the determination, the camaraderie, and the ultimate tragedy of the 50 men who were murdered. The film ended with a title card. 50 of the escaped prisoners of war were executed by the Gestapo. The Nazis responsible were brought to trial after the war. It was a simple statement of fact. But for audiences around the world, it transformed an abstract number into something real. 50 men, with names and faces and lives, who had been murdered for trying to go home. The success of the film brought renewed attention to the survivors and to the families of the dead. Flight Lieutenant Wally Floody, the Canadian mining engineer who had designed the tunnels but had been transferred to another camp before the escape, served as a technical advisor on the film. He spent months on set, helping to recreate the conditions inside Stalag Luft III and ensuring that the tunnel sequences were as accurate as possible. "I wanted people to understand what it was really like," Floody said in a 1963 interview. "The darkness, the fear, the cramped spaces, the constant threat of discovery. Those men lived with that every day for over a year. They deserved to have their story told right." Floody attended the film's premiere in London, walking the red carpet alongside Steve McQueen and the other stars. He was 70 years old, a white-haired veteran who still remembered every inch of those tunnels he had dug 2 decades earlier. He died in 1989, having spent his final years speaking to schools and veterans groups about the escape and the men who did not return. They were heroes, Floody said in his last public speech. Not because they were brave, though they were. Not because they were clever, though they were that too, but because they never gave up. Even when the odds were impossible, even when they knew they might die, they never stopped fighting. The legacy of the Great Escape extended beyond memory and commemoration. It changed the way the world thought about prisoners of war. In the aftermath of the murders, the Allied governments launched a diplomatic campaign to strengthen protections for captured soldiers. The 1929 Geneva Convention, they argued, had proven inadequate. It had failed to prevent the Nazis from executing prisoners in cold blood. In 1949, a new Geneva Convention was signed, one that explicitly prohibited the execution of prisoners of war under any circumstances. It required that captured soldiers be treated humanely, held in safe conditions, and returned to their home countries after the end of hostilities. The murders at Stalag Luft III were cited repeatedly during the negotiations as an example of what must never be allowed to happen again. The 50 men who died in 1944 did not die in vain, British delegate Sir Robert Craigie said during the conference. Their sacrifice has shown us the consequences of inadequate protections for prisoners of war. We must ensure that no future conflict produces such atrocities. The 1949 Geneva Convention remains in force today, the foundation of international humanitarian law governing the treatment of prisoners. Every soldier captured in every conflict since 1949 has been protected, at least in theory, by the legacy of the 50 men murdered after the Great Escape. The 3 men who achieved true freedom, Per Bergsland, Jens Müller, and Bram van der Stok, lived long lives after the war. Bergsland and Müller, the 2 Norwegian pilots who had reached Sweden by ship from Stettin, returned to their homeland after the liberation. They rejoined the Royal Norwegian Air Force and served until the end of the war. Bergsland died in 1992 at the age of 74. He had rarely spoken publicly about the escape, preferring to let others tell the story. But in private, he remained haunted by the memory of those who had not made it. "We were the lucky ones," he told a friend shortly before his death. 3 out of 76, that is not a success, that is a tragedy with 3 exceptions. Müller lived until 1999, dying at 82. He wrote a memoir about his wartime experiences, including a detailed account of the escape and the journey to Sweden. It was published in Norwegian and later translated into English. Bram van der Stok had the longest and most remarkable post-war career of the 3. After reaching England via the French resistance, Spain, and Gibraltar, van der Stok rejoined the Royal Dutch Air Force and flew combat missions until the end of the war. He was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross by the British and multiple decorations by the Dutch government. After the war, van der Stok emigrated to the United States, where he trained as a physician. He spent the next 4 decades practicing medicine, first as a surgeon, then as a specialist in aerospace medicine. He worked for NASA during the early years of the American space program, helping to develop medical protocols for astronauts. He rarely spoke about the escape. When asked, he would deflect the questions, insisting that the real heroes were the 50 men who had died. "I survived because I was lucky," van der Stok said in a rare interview. "That is all. The men who died, they were the brave ones. They paid the price. I simply walked away." Van der Stok died in 1993 at the age of 76, the same age as the number of men who had crawled through Tunnel Harry nearly 50 years earlier. It was a coincidence he would have appreciated. More than 80 years have passed since 76 men crawled through a tunnel beneath the frozen earth of Stalag Luft III. The world they escaped into, the world of Nazi Germany, of total war, of unimaginable cruelty and unimaginable courage, has receded into history. The barracks have rotted away. The guard towers have crumbled. The barbed wire has rusted into the soil. But the story endures. It endures in the books that have been written, dozens of them in a dozen languages, each one adding new details to the narrative. It endures in the films that have been made, from the 1963 classic to countless documentaries that have explored every aspect of the escape. It endures in the museums and memorials that dot the landscape of Europe, from the site of the camp in Poland to the Commonwealth War Graves cemeteries where the dead are buried. And it endures in the memories of those who were touched by the story, the families of the dead, the descendants of the survivors, the millions of people around the world who have read the book or watched the film and felt something stir within them. Something that transcends time and place. Something that speaks to the deepest parts of what it means to be human. What is it about the Great Escape that continues to captivate us after all these years? Perhaps it is the ingenuity, the sheer brilliance of the men who dug those tunnels, who forged those documents, who built compasses from melted records and tailored suits from prison blankets. In an age of sophisticated technology, there is something deeply inspiring about what human beings can accomplish with nothing but determination and resourcefulness. Perhaps it is the courage, the willingness of 700 men to risk everything for freedom, knowing that the odds were against them, knowing that capture could mean death. In a world that often seems defined by cynicism and self-interest, the selflessness of the prisoners at Stalag Luft III reminds us that heroism is not a myth. Perhaps it is the tragedy, the heartbreaking contrast between the hope of that March night and the horror that followed. 50 men, shot in the back on lonely roads, cremated to destroy the evidence of their murder. There is something in that injustice that demands remembrance, that refuses to be forgotten. Or perhaps it is something simpler. Perhaps it is the universal human longing for home. The men who escaped through Tunnel Harry came from all over the world. They were British and Canadian, Australian and New Zealand. They were Polish and Czech, Norwegian and Belgian, French and Greek and South African. They spoke different languages, worshipped different gods, held different political beliefs. But they shared one thing in common. They wanted to go home. They wanted to see their mothers and fathers again. They wanted to hold their wives, to play with their children, to walk the streets of their hometowns and breathe the air of their own countries. They wanted to return to the lives that had been stolen from them by war, the careers interrupted, the plans postponed, the futures put on hold. They were willing to crawl through 330 feet of darkness for that chance. They were willing to risk everything. And 50 of them were willing to die. That is not a story that fades with time. That is a story that speaks to something eternal, something that every human being in every era can understand. The longing for home. The refusal to surrender. The unbroken spirit. Squadron Leader Roger Bushell understood this better than anyone. He had been warned by the Germans that another escape attempt would cost him his life. He had been threatened, interrogated, watched constantly. He knew the risks better than any man in the camp. And yet he chose to try. Not because he thought he would succeed, not because he believed he would make it back to England and rejoin the fight, but because the act of trying itself was a form of resistance, a declaration that the Nazis could imprison his body but never his spirit. "We have a duty to escape," Bushell told his men. "Not just for ourselves, but for the war effort. Every German soldier hunting for us is a soldier not fighting on the front lines." It was a practical argument, but beneath the practicality was something deeper, a belief that freedom was worth fighting for, even when the fight seemed hopeless. Bushell never made it home. But his spirit, the spirit of the Great Escape, lives on. The last surviving escaper died in 2019. His name was Flight Lieutenant Richard Churchill, known to his friends as Dick. He had been number 38 through Tunnel Harry, escaping into the frozen night alongside dozens of other men. He was captured within days, but he was not selected for execution. He lived for another 75 years. In his final interview, conducted just months before his death at the age of 99, Churchill was asked what the escape had meant to him. He was silent for a long moment. "It meant everything," he said finally. "Not because we succeeded, we didn't, not really. Only 3 men made it home, but because we tried, because we refused to accept that we were beaten, because we showed them and ourselves that the human spirit cannot be caged. He paused, his eyes glistening with the memory of friends long dead. 50 of my mates were murdered, Churchill continued. Shot in the back like criminals. I've thought about them every day for 75 years. Roger, Tim, Al, all of them, they deserve to grow old. They deserve to go home. They deserve to live. His voice broke. But they didn't. And so the best I can do, the best any of us can do, is remember them. Tell their stories. Make sure the world never forgets what they did and what was done to them. Richard Churchill died peacefully in his sleep on February 18, 2019. With his passing, the last living link to that March night in 1944 was severed. There are no more survivors to interview, no more first-hand accounts to record, no more old men with fading memories and trembling hands who can say, I was there. I crawled through that tunnel. I breathed that frozen air. But the story does not die with them. It lives on in the books and films, in the museums and memorials, in the graves at Poznan and the reconstructed barracks at Zagin. It lives on in the classrooms where teachers tell their students about 76 men who refused to surrender and 50 men who paid the ultimate price. It lives on in the hearts of everyone who has ever heard the story and felt inspired by it, inspired to persevere, to resist, to fight for freedom even when the odds seem impossible. That is the true legacy of the Great Escape. Not the tunnel itself, remarkable as it was. Not the forged documents or the tailored suits or the homemade compasses. But the spirit, the unbreakable, unquenchable, undying spirit of men who refused to accept defeat. The 50th anniversary of the escape in 1994 brought together the last surviving escapers for a final reunion. They gathered at the site of Stalag Luft III, old men now, in their 70s and 80s, walking with canes and leaning on the arms of their children and grandchildren. They stood at the spot where Tunnel Harry had emerged from the earth, where 76 men had crawled into the darkness 50 years before. A memorial service was held, prayers were offered. The names of the 50 dead were read aloud, one by one, as a bugler played the last post. And then, in a moment that no one who witnessed it would ever forget, the survivors raised their glasses in a final toast. To the 50, said Sidney Dowes, his voice steady despite his years. To our friends, to the bravest men we ever knew. To the 50, the others echoed. They drank in silence. And then they went home, to England, to Canada, to Australia, to all the countries they had once fought so hard to reach. They went home. Today, when you visit the site of Stalag Luft III, you will find a quiet clearing surrounded by pine trees. The barracks are gone, the guard towers are gone, the barbed wire is gone. But if you look carefully, you can still see the depressions in the earth where the buildings once stood. You can still trace the outline of the perimeter. You can still find the spot where Tunnel Harry emerged into the night. A stone marker stands near that spot, a simple monument with an inscription in Polish and English. In memory of the officers of the Royal Air Force and Allied Air Forces who escaped from Stalag Luft III on the night of 24-25 March 1944. 50 of them were murdered by the Gestapo. Visitors come from around the world to stand before that marker. They leave flowers, flags, photographs, handwritten notes. One note left by the grandchild of a survivor reads simply, "Grandpa told me about you. I will never forget." The story of the Great Escape is a story of triumph and tragedy, of hope and horror, of the highest courage and the lowest cruelty. It is a story of 76 men who crawled through a tunnel into the frozen darkness, seeking nothing more than the right to go home. It is a story of 50 men who were murdered for that dream, shot in the back on lonely roads, cremated to hide the evidence, erased by a regime that believed it could silence dissent with bullets and fire. But the regime was wrong. The Nazis are gone. Their 1,000-year Reich lasted barely 12 years. Their leaders were hanged or shot themselves. Their empire crumbled into dust. And yet the 50 men they murdered are remembered still. Their names are carved in stone at Poznan. Their stories are told in books and films around the world. Their sacrifice is honored every year on the anniversary of the escape by people who never knew them but who understand what they did and why it mattered. They are not forgotten. They will never be forgotten. On the night of March 24th, 1944, 76 men crawled through a tunnel 330 feet long, emerging into the frozen German night with nothing but forged papers, homemade compasses, and the unshakable belief that freedom was worth any risk. 3 of them reached safety. 23 were recaptured and survived the war. 50 were murdered by the Gestapo on the direct orders of Adolf Hitler. Their crime was simple. They had tried to go home. The men who killed them were hunted down after the war. 21 were executed. 17 more were imprisoned. Justice was served, imperfectly, incompletely, but served nonetheless. And the memory of the 50 lived on, in the hearts of the survivors, in the grief of the families, in the conscience of a world that had witnessed what happens when tyranny goes unchecked. Squadron Leader Roger Bushell, Flight Lieutenant Bernard Schadehauer, Flight Lieutenant Thomas Kirby Green, Flight Lieutenant Gordon Kidder, Flight Lieutenant James Katnack, Flight Lieutenant Arnold Christensen. 50 names, 50 lives, 50 men who refused to surrender, even when surrender was the only rational choice. They did not die in vain. They died for something that can never be defeated, the human longing for freedom, the refusal to accept captivity, the unbreakable spirit that defines the best of who we are. And as long as their story is told, that spirit will live on. Forever unbroken, forever remembered, forever free.